We're back in the Agriland tent for our live stream, and we're joined now by Pat McCormack, the President of the ICMSA. Pat, thanks very much for coming into us.
My pleasure, Claire.
Pat, first off, I suppose I have to ask you about the agreement that has been reached, or was reached at the weekend, on beef sector reform. You were in there, Pat, around the table, alongside 7 other farm lobby groups. Can you describe the mood? What was the sentiment in the room in order to get the agreement on the deal?
I suppose it is an agreement, whichever way you would like to term it. And obviously no side was happy. You're quite right. I led the ICMSA delegation there. There were 6 other representative bodies there as well. And I suppose that in itself was unprecedented in the past. Obviously, in the previous round of discussions outside in Blackweston, we had the beef clan group. On this occasion, we had the independent farmers as well. Certainly, there's a lot of tension out there. Farm families, I suppose, there's an onus on us to try and deliver something economically meaningful to farm families during those talks.
And do you think that you achieved those goals with this agreement? Do you think it's a good deal for farmers?
I'm not going to say it's a good deal for farmers, but certainly at this point in time, I think it's in the interests of farmers, their farm families, and in particular after the discussions that I have had this morning, I feel that our business, our industry, our beef industry needs to be back up and moving. In particular, I suppose we need to be processing cattle. We are obviously an 85-90% exporting nation, and we're doing some severe damage to our reputation out there. And, roll on next Monday morning, and I'm not scaremongering, it's the reality. The stocks aren't going to be there, and we're not going to be able to fulfil our commitments as an industry.
Yet there is an awful lot of frustration and despair still out there. There are still picket lines around some of the factories. What is ICMSA doing to try and move forward or progress or explain what's in this agreement and how it might work for farmers?
Well, obviously we're explaining it, and we'd encourage all farmers at picket lines to get their hands on the agreement and to read down through it. Obviously the 12-cent inspect bonus has moved to 20 cents, and there's an inspect bonus for animals over 30 months between that and 36 at 8 cents. And you can say the differential of 12 cents is still there. We see the O- and the 4 pluses come in for a 12-cent bonus as well. So that has to be welcomed. There's probably 200,000 cattle in the national kill that are going to be brought in for an inspect bonus. But I'd certainly ask people to reflect, because believe it or believe it not, and I'm fully aware there was even a vote in my own county last night in Care where the majority of the protesters said they wanted to stay on the picket. I suppose the reality of it is that the majority of farmers are not on the picket, and there is a silent majority out there who are very, very anxious to kill stock at this point in time for a variety of reasons. They're doing it from an economic point of view as well as a practical farming point of view. And we don't want to find, some farmer, through no fault of his own, in a battle with a vulture fund as a result of not being able to make their commitments to the financial institutions. There's a lot of things this time of the year, the contractors knocking on the door, the VAT, and the second round of grazing for anyone who's taking land on a long-term lease. So there's huge frustration out there, and I fully understand why the farmers went to the picket lines. They're 10, if not 15, 20 years in a low-margin business that has resulted in a no-margin business. We have a beam scheme that was introduced that excludes a significant proportion of dairy farmers. But as well as that, for those farmers that are eligible, they have to reduce stock by 5%. And for a lot of active farmers, that's something that's very, very hard for them to do, because they've given all their life trying to increase their income by pushing output. And that has brought us to where we are today.
Pat, if we just drill into some of the detail which you mentioned there on the deal, the inclusion of a new quality payment for O-4+ grade cattle. Is this a plus for dairy to beef farmers?
Well, there's animals progeny coming from the suckler herd as well that may not have the same confirmation as the E and the U, and some of those would have come into the O- as well. It's it's across all grades, but or all spec of animal and the different farming types. But certainly, I suppose it can be perceived that it is to the benefit of progeny from the dairy herd, but one must remember that 56% of the animals slaughtered originate in dairy herds. And I heard around the table the other day people describe them as a byproduct of the dairy herd. They're not. They are actually the tool that can be used by beef farmers if there is a viable income. And it's about creating an economic sustainability for for the farmers, whether they're suckler farmers or beef farmers who buy calf to beef or whaling to beef or year and a half to beef from the dairy herd.
So are you saying that there's an onus there on farmers as well to maybe be broad-minded on other ways to bring more efficiency and more sustainability, more economic sustainability into their own systems?
I think, to be fair to farmers, they have moved a massive amount in the last decade, maybe 2 decades, as regards making themselves as viable as they possibly can inside the farm gate. But as an industry, we need to be returning something that will deliver a sustainable economic income for farmers, because without a sustainable economic income for farmers, whether they're dairy and beef, and his beef is in question at this point in time, we'd have a very, very different rural Ireland. And it wouldn't be a better rural Ireland. We are the backbone. Irish agriculture is the backbone of rural Ireland. You have a 26-county republic, but you have 25 counties with the same economic driver, and that's agriculture, dairy and beef, or beef and dairy, whichever way you want to look at it.
And look, Pat, MII, Meat Industry Ireland, have said that this agreement will not stand if protests are not called off, basically, if they don't stand down. Is that a real concern for you at this point, or do you think that the agreement will progress from here?
It is a real concern, I suppose. That was a critical point where they'd be back up and running. And as you said, the 7 organisations were to agree to that, and did agree to that around the table, it's fair to say. I suppose it's taken a bit of time, or more time maybe than some would have thought, to get individuals to fully understand and to be satisfied in the medium term or the short term with this agreement. I think there will be a more transparent industry as a result of the agreement last Sunday, but that will take time. There's a task force set up, and hopefully that will deliver for farm families, because that's what we want to do, deliver for farm families.
Pat, if I could just move on to calf exports, and if we reflect back on last spring, there was a lot of pressure on calf price. That's expected to snowball next spring at current beef prices. Not all calves can be exported, and they're going to end up on beef farms. What are your thoughts on the price outlook for calves over the coming spring?
Well, look, one would have to be concerned that it's obviously supply and demand. The dairy herd has expanded somewhat over the last decade. They've become more compact in calving, and there is an issue there at the peak calving period, I suppose, particularly from an export point of view, from mid-February to mid-March. And that's how we manage that going forward. There is a labour issue out there on farms, and I think there needs to be a greater degree of collaboration between dairy and beef farmers as regards the beef industry into the future. Maybe it would be beneficial that they'd move to a beef farm a week before they could go to a mart, and that beef farmer would get value for money, whether that's an Angus, a Hereford, or indeed the Frisian. And I suppose there is a major question mark over the value of the Frisian calf into the future. But hopefully for 2020 that we will have a viable export market, and hopefully we'll be in a position to fulfil the vessels. And we're seriously lobbying Minister Creed to set up an independent export committee to look at, from a farmer point of view and from an exporter's point of view and the department point of view, to maximise the numbers moving out. I mean, we need cooperation between the exporters, and if we can get cooperation between the exporters, it's possible that we can have a walk-on, walk-off. I'm not saying that's going to be the solution in 2025, but it certainly is the solution for 2020 and the spring of 2020.
Pat, you mentioned there about collaboration between both sectors, between the beef and the dairy, the beef farmer and the dairy farmer. Just how can you expand on that, on how that could potentially work?
Well, there's a duty and an obligation, I suppose, on the dairy industry and the dairy farmer when they're breeding an animal, that when they have a sufficient amount of replacements bred, that they breed an animal that has a purpose in the beef industry, where the purchaser of that animal can leave themselves with a margin going forward, because if they give 2 years looking at them or 2.5 years looking at them, they need to be in a position that they're not going in with a P-grade animal. They need to be in a position that they're up the ladder, whether it's an O or above that. And we've seen ICBF introduce the beef index for dairy herds this year, and hopefully that will deliver an economic return, not alone for the primary producer, but for the guy who buys him. Because if there isn't a guy out there to buy him, a lot of dairy herds have gone specialised in dairy and then have dropped their beef enterprise. And it's critical for everybody that there is a margin there if they carry those beef through, because otherwise, why be at it?
Another issue, Pat, we have to raise is kind of the social licence there on the dairy side. Animal welfare has been a big concern over the course of last spring, and you had Minister Creed coming out on multiple occasions just highlighting the issue of animal welfare and how important it is to our live export markets. How concerned is ICMSA about the issue of welfare on the dairy side when it comes to the calves?
We've huge concerns about the welfare and our reputation. Obviously, we're an exporting nation, so our welfare is critical to us. I suppose the difference, hopefully, the difference between the spring of 2020 and our previous two springs is, there was a shortage of fodder. There was bad weather in the spring of 18. There was a shortage of fodder in 19. That created stress levels for farmers, and they weren't able to give. Maybe some farmers weren't able to give the due level of diligence that they normally would. Obviously, nobody's in charge of the weather, but you would think that stocks of fodder are in a better place and that farmers will be able to work their way through in a better way. Obviously, we have to be conscious that as dairy farmers, we may have to keep those calves on farm a little longer and look at our ability from a labour perspective and from a facilities perspective.
Okay, Pat, look, there's loads more we'd like to talk to you about, and we'll be chatting to you again. Pat, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, there.